You've been told a story about money. It goes like this. A long time ago, before money existed, people traded. You had chickens, your neighbor had bread, you swapped, and one day the story says, this got too clumsy, so somebody invented money to fix it. That story is in your old school books. And for the last 100 years, anthropologists have searched for a single society that actually worked this way. They have never found one. Not even one. The barter economy that supposedly gave birth to money is a myth. Money did not come from trade. It came from something darker. And once you see what money really is, you start to notice a pattern. Every form of money humans have ever invented has followed the same arc. It gets created. People come to trust it. Then power captures it, quietly drains its value, and it collapses. Shells, coins, paper, gold, the money you work for every day. The same story over and over for 10,000 years. This is the entire history of money, and it ends somewhere you are not going to expect. So if money didn't start with barter, where did it start? Before there were coins, before there were even shells, there was debt. Picture a village 10,000 years ago. You help your neighbor fix his roof. He doesn't pay you, he just owes you. That favor sits there until one day he hands you grain and the debt is settled. That is the real first money. It was not an object. It was a memory, a record of who owes what to whom. And we can prove it. The temples of ancient Mesopotamia were recording these debts in silver 5,000 years ago, long before the first coin existed. Money was never invented to make shopping easier. It was invented to keep score. And the moment you can keep score, you can rig the game. Everything that comes next is that one story. 10,000 years of people finding new ways to rig it. As villages grew into cities, that web of memory got too big to hold in anyone's head. So people needed a physical stand-in, an object everyone agreed was valuable, and humans tried almost everything. Cattle, salt. On the island of Yap, giant stone discs too heavy to ever move. Across Africa and Asia, the cowrie shell became one of the most widely used currencies in human history. Each of these worked for one reason. Everyone agreed it was scarce. But scarcity is fragile. The moment outsiders flooded a region with cheap shells from elsewhere, the local money collapsed overnight. The objects kept changing. The weakness never did. The real fix arrived around 600 BC in a kingdom called Lydia in what is now Western Turkey. Their rivers carried electrum, a natural blend of gold and silver, but every lump had a different purity, so nobody could agree what it was worth. So the Lydian kings melted it down, fixed the weight, fixed the purity, and stamped each piece with the royal seal. That stamp was a promise. The king guarantees this. You no longer had to weigh it or test it. You just trusted the face on the coin. This was the first true coinage, and within 2 centuries it had spread across the ancient world. But notice what happened. For the first time, money carried a ruler's face. Money and political power had fused into the same object, and that handed whoever wore the crown a temptation no ruler has ever resisted. Rome is where that temptation became a science. The Roman denarius started as a silver coin you could trust. Under the Emperor Augustus, it was almost pure silver. But running an empire is expensive, and the emperors discovered a trick that felt like magic. Take the silver coins back in through taxes, melt them down, mix in cheap copper, restamp them at the same face value. Now you have more coins than you started with. You have created money out of nothing. Each emperor did it a little more than the last. By the year 270, the denarius that was once nearly pure silver contained barely 5%. The coin looked the same. The number on it was the same, but it was mostly worthless metal. Romans were not stupid. They watched prices climb and started hiding the old good coins while spending the new bad ones. The empire was inflating its way into a crisis, and the money collapsed long before the empire did. Rome would not be the last to try this. It was just the first to do it at scale. While Rome shaved its coins, the other side of the world made a leap nobody had dared before. In China, hauling strings of heavy copper coins around was exhausting, so merchants began leaving their coins with a trusted shop and walking away with a paper receipt instead. By the 11th century, under the Song dynasty, the government issued the world's first official paper money. For a while, it was brilliant. Then the Mongols conquered China, and Kublai Khan made paper money the only legal currency in his empire, backed by nothing but his own command. When Marco Polo saw it, he wrote that the Khan had mastered the secret of alchemy, turning plain paper into the wealth of a kingdom. But paper has the same flaw as a Roman coin, only worse. A coin you have to physically melt down, paper you just print. And the emperors printed and printed. The money lost so so much value that the Ming Dynasty eventually gave up on paper entirely and crawled back to metal. Different empire, different material, the same ending Rome had already lived through. For most of history, money sat still. Renaissance Italy changed that. It turned money into something that moves and grows on its own. The stars of this story are one family, the Medici of Florence. The Medici Bank, founded in 1397, did not get rich mining gold or conquering land. It got rich on a piece of paper called a bill of exchange. The church had banned charging interest on loans. They called it usury, and they called it a sin, so the Medici dressed interest up as a currency exchange. A merchant deposited money in Florence and collected it months later in London, in another currency, and the bank's profit was hidden inside the exchange rate. A loan, with the sin neatly removed. The Medici used that power to fund popes, crown kings, and bankroll the Renaissance. Money had stopped being a pile of metal you could count. It had become a network, invisible, fast, abstract, and the harder money is to see, the easier it becomes to quietly drain. The oldest pattern was about to get much harder to spot. For centuries after, the world tried to anchor money to something a king could not fake: gold. The logic was simple. Every paper note was a promise. Carry it to a bank, and you could swap it for a fixed amount of real gold. The money supply was chained to how much metal a country actually held. Britain led the way, and by the late 1800s, most of the trading world had followed onto the gold standard. For a few decades, it worked beautifully. Prices were stable, but gold has a hard limit. And when a war comes, a government needs to spend far more than its gold reserves allow. So during the First World War, country after country quietly suspended the rule and printed what they needed. The anchor, it turned out, was only ever attached when it was convenient, and one country showed the world what happens when you let go completely. After losing the First World War, Germany was forced to pay enormous sums it did not have. So it printed, around the clock. By 1923, the money broke. Prices doubled every couple of days. A loaf of bread that cost a couple of marks before the war cost hundreds of billions by the end of the year. People burned banknotes for heat, because the paper was cheaper than firewood. An entire nation's savings was wiped out in a matter of months. It was the same pattern as Rome, the same pattern as China, only now it took months, not centuries. And the ruin it left behind helped drag the world into another war. After the Second World War, the world needed a new system. In 1944, delegates from 44 countries gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The deal was this: the US dollar would be tied to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other currency would be tied to the dollar. The world no longer trusted gold directly. It trusted America's promise to hold the gold for everyone. This is the moment the US dollar quietly became the center of the entire planet's money. And it all worked on one assumption: that America would always keep enough gold to honor the promise. For about 25 years it held, and then America started spending. By the late 1960s, the United States was paying for a war in Vietnam and expensive new programs at home all at once. It was sending far more dollars into the world than it had gold to back them. France did the math and started demanding actual gold for its dollars. The vaults were draining fast. On August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and told the world the dollar could no longer be exchanged for gold. He called it temporary. It was permanent. In that one announcement, the last link between money and any physical thing on Earth was cut. For the first time in history, the money of the entire planet was backed by nothing you could hold. Only trust in the government that printed it. We had arrived at pure fiat money. Fiat is a Latin word. It means let it be done. Fiat money has value because the government says it does. For no other reason. The note in your wallet is not a claim on gold. It is not a claim on anything. It is worth something because everyone around you agrees to keep pretending that it is. And once money is no longer chained to a rock, the supply has no limit. A government can create more whenever it chooses with a single keystroke. The US dollar has lost more than 80% of its purchasing power since Nixon cut it loose from gold. The number on the bill never changes. It just quietly buys you less every year. This is the same trick the Roman emperors used, the same trick the Chinese emperors used. We just stopped calling it watering down the money. We started calling it monetary policy. For decades, the system held. Until 2008, banks had bundled millions of risky home loans into products they sold as perfectly safe, then placed enormous bets on them, layer on layer. When American house prices stopped rising, the tower came down. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers, a bank that had survived over 150 years, collapsed in a single weekend. For a few days, the global financial system looked like it might stop, and the response revealed what fiat money really is. Governments and central banks created trillions of new dollars from nothing, and used them to rescue the very banks that had caused the crisis. The people who took the risk got bailed out. The public absorbed the cost through the slow erosion of their savings. Millions lost their homes and their jobs, then watched the institutions responsible get rescued with money conjured on a screen. And a lot of those people came out of 2008 asking a dangerous question. Why do we trust these institutions with our money at all? Someone was asking that question while the crisis was still unfolding. On October 31st, 2008, a person or group using the name Satoshi Nakamoto published a 9-page document. It described a new kind of money called Bitcoin. Money with no government, no bank, no central authority of any kind. Instead of trusting an institution, you would trust a shared public record kept by thousands of computers around the world at once that nobody could secretly edit. In a strange way, it was a return to the first idea: money as a record of who owes what to whom. Except this one answered to no king and no emperor, and the supply was capped. Only 21 million Bitcoin will ever exist. Nobody can print more. When Satoshi launched it in January 2009, he buried a message inside the very first block, a newspaper headline about banks getting bailed out. For the first time in 10,000 years, here was money that power could not quietly debase. At least, that was the promise. But power does not give up control of money. It never has. Governments watched the rise of digital currency and drew their own conclusion. If money is going digital, it should be their digital money. That is the central bank digital currency, a CBDC, your national currency in a purely digital form issued directly by the central bank. It sounds harmless, convenient even. But physical cash is private. A digital currency issued by the state is not. Every transaction can be seen, every transaction can be tracked, and money that is programmable can be controlled. It could be set to expire if you do not spend it fast enough. It could be blocked from certain purchases. China is already rolling out its digital yuan to hundreds of millions of people. More than 100 countries are now exploring some version of the same idea. Money began as a tool to keep score. Because this is not history anymore, the next form of money is being decided right now in rooms you will never sit in. And it comes down to two versions. One has no owner, a hard limit nobody can print past. The other sees everything. Money that can be tracked to the cent, switched off, or told what it is allowed to buy by whoever holds the keys. One of them is going to win. It could be running on your phone inside 10 years, and no one is going to stop and ask which one you wanted. For 10,000 years, money has never once been just money. It has been the quiet machine that decides who holds power over whom. Every ruler in this story understood that, from Rome to that hotel room in 1944. The only people who never seem to understand it are the ones holding the money. That is the real trick. Money works on you best when you are not paying attention to it. Right now, you are paying attention. So when the next kind arrives, the only question that matters is the one humans have faced in every age before this. Who will look around your room, the walls around you, the light overhead, the air going in and out of your lungs without you ever thinking about it. All of it feels permanent, like the world has always been like this. It hasn't. Rewind far enough, and this exact spot becomes a place that would kill you in under a minute. There is no air you could breathe. The ground is literally liquid rock, and the sky glows orange like the inside of a furnace. For more than 99% of this planet's existence, nothing remotely like you was here. Earth got along just fine without us for 4.5 billion years. Something was ruling the planet that entire time, and for almost all of it, it was nothing you'd recognize. 4.5 billion years is a number your brain simply can't hold. So forget the numbers for a second. Think of it like this. Imagine a stadium filled with popcorn. If all of that popcorn represented the entire history of Earth, then all of human history would be equal to one single kernel near the top of the pile. That is how small we actually are. We are a single grain of sand in the whole Sahara Desert, a single drop of water in the entire ocean. So what would happen if you stepped out onto Earth as it was 4.5 billion years ago? Well, the first thing that happens is you die. The entire surface is an ocean of lava under a thick orange haze of carbon dioxide. There's no moon in the sky either. It hasn't formed yet. A planet about the size of Mars, which scientists named Theia, has just slammed into the young Earth at an angle. The crash threw an enormous spray of debris into orbit, and over millions of years that debris will slowly clump together into the moon you see in the sky. The same impact also knocked the planet over by about 23 degrees. And that little tilt is the only reason we have have seasons at all. Day 1 and a slightly different impact would have meant we never happened. Once the lava cooled and the first oceans formed, life appeared, but you would not have recognized it as life at all. For the next 2 billion years, this planet belonged to things too small to see. They were single-celled microbes, a whole living world that was invisible to the naked eye. There were no plants, no animals, nothing with a face at all, just specks of slime, running the entire Earth. Do not mistake them for primitive. These specks ruled longer than every plant, every animal, and every dinosaur that ever lived combined. The air back then would have killed you. One breath of it with no oxygen at all, and you'd drop where you stood. Then those microbes did something that almost ended everything. Some of them learned to eat sunlight. We call it photosynthesis. Photosynthesis gives off a waste gas, oxygen. To you, oxygen is life. To almost everything alive back then, it was poison. As it built up in the air, it wiped out huge amounts of the life that couldn't handle it. Geologists call this the Great Oxidation Event, which is a very polite name for one of the biggest die-offs the planet has ever seen. But the same gas did something else. It stripped away the gases that had been trapping the planet's heat, and without them, the whole thing froze over, very possibly from pole to pole, into a single ball of ice. So the air sitting in your lungs right now is the leftover from a catastrophe, one that nearly wiped out the very life that created it. Life clung on under the ice. But for more than 1 billion years after that, the biggest thing alive was still microscopic. Then, a little over 500 million years ago, in a burst called the Cambrian explosion, life suddenly got big and weird and fast. For the first time, the oceans filled with creatures you could actually see. Plants crept out onto bare rock and built the first soil. Then, fish in the shallows slowly grew legs, and the first uneasy animals hauled themselves up onto dry land. Forests rose. Swamps spread for thousands of miles. The coal we dig up and burn today is the buried remains of those exact forests. After 4 billion years of fire, ice, and poison, Earth was finally green and warm and alive. And then it tried to die again. This is where the world gets genuinely alien. Picture Earth around 260 million years ago, long before a single dinosaur exists. The days are shorter here, only about 22 hours long, because the planet is spinning faster than it does today. And the thing in charge isn't a dinosaur. Dinosaurs don't exist yet. It's something older and arguably worse. They were called Gorgonopsids, and they were among the very first animals on Earth to grow saber teeth. The biggest of them was a monster called Inostrancevia, which is basically the scientific name for a bear-sized killing machine with curved fangs as long as your hand, built to slice straight through flesh. For a long stretch of this world, if you were a plant eater, it didn't matter how big you grew. One of these things was waiting for you. Strangely, the safest place to be was underwater. The seas back then were calm and mostly free of anything big enough to hurt you. On land, there were no breaks at all. And then came the closest call life on Earth has ever had. Around 252 million years ago, a region of what's now Siberia tore open and stayed open, pouring out lava across an area the size of Western Europe, on and off for hundreds of thousands of years. It pumped so much carbon dioxide into the air that the whole planet roasted. The oceans heated toward bathwater temperatures, and the oxygen in the sea crashed. By the time it finally ended, the overwhelming majority of species on Earth were simply gone. By some estimates, as many as 9 in every 10. This is the event geologists call the Great Dying. Life did not recover in a few thousand years. It came within a hair of ending altogether, and it stayed broken for a very long time. Recovery, when it came, arrived in the strangest possible form: rain. Starting around 234 million years ago, the skies opened, and then they simply kept going for about 2 million years. A world that had been hot and bone dry turned into a planet of constant storms. In that soggy, transformed landscape, a group of animals that had been minor background players finally got their shot. At the start of all that rain, dinosaurs were maybe 5% of the land animals. By the time it stopped, they were more than 90%. The rain didn't just refill the rivers, it handed the entire planet over to the dinosaurs, and they held on to it for more than 150 million years. You probably know roughly how their reign ends. 66 million years ago, a rock around 10 kilometers wide slammed into the Earth and rewrote the rules in a single afternoon. The impact threw so much rock and ash into the sky that the sun effectively went out for months. Plants died in the dark. Everything that ate plants starved, and everything that ate those animals starved right behind them. The giants had no chance, but the small, furry, frightened little things that could burrow underground waited out and eat almost anything, crawled through the wreckage, and survived. Those small, furry survivors were mammals. your ancestors. And here is the part actually worth sitting with. If that asteroid misses, the dinosaurs almost certainly keep running the show, and those little survivors stay small and forgettable forever. That rock didn't just end a world, it opened the only door we ever had. The single worst day in the history of large life on Earth is the entire reason you exist. Even then, we very nearly didn't make it. When our own species, Homo sapiens, finally appeared around 300,000 years ago, we were not the only humans alive. At least 4 other human species were here at the very same time. Other kinds of people, as real as we are, sharing the same world. Some of them had been around far longer than we had. Today, every single one of them is gone, and we are the only kind of human left standing. We are not the main characters of this story. We are the survivors of the survivors of the survivors. So look around the room one more time. Everything in it is balanced on top of a stack of disasters. A frozen planet, an extinction that almost wiped the board clean, and a rock from space that erased an entire world to make room for yours. Take away any single one of those, and the air never reaches your lungs. And this exact moment never happens. The world before us was never a warm-up act, waiting around for humans to show up. It was 4.5 billion years of a planet that did not need us at all, running on lava and microbes and monsters and luck. We are new here, almost impossibly new. And the strangest part is that you were never the point of any of it. You are simply what happened to be left standing when the... Why are you right-handed or left-handed? It feels like a question we should have answered by now. We haven't. But what we have figured out is genuinely strange. Your dominant hand was picked for you before you took your first breath. Roughly 1 in 10 humans is left-handed, and that ratio has held for at least the last 500,000 years. No human population anywhere has ever been mostly left-handed, and no other animal on Earth, not even chimpanzees, has the same strong one-sided preference we do. Doctors can predict before a baby is even born whether they will be right-handed or left-handed. They do it by watching which hand the fetus moves toward its own mouth on the ultrasound. And once that pattern locks in, it almost never flips. The 500,000-year part comes from bones. The dominant arm gets longer, denser, slightly stronger from a lifetime of use. When archaeologists dig up ancient skeletons, roughly 10% of them show the signs of being left-handed in life, exactly like the world today. So something specific is happening in your brain that pushes almost all of us toward one side, and that something is ancient. In a cave in Croatia, scientists examined the teeth of a Neanderthal who died about 130,000 years ago. Their front teeth had tiny diagonal scratches across them. The Neanderthal had been cleaning an animal hide so it could be used as clothing. They bit down on one edge to hold it steady. They pulled the hide tight with one hand. With the other, they scraped it clean with a sharp stone tool. Sometimes the stone slipped, and the edge scratched their front teeth. The direction of those scratches reveals which hand held the tool, and the answer, again and again across the fossil record, is the right hand. Even a Homo habilis specimen from nearly 2 million years ago left the same scratch pattern on its teeth. Long before language, before farming, before any art we have ever found, our family was already favoring the right. The cave paintings agree. On rock walls across Europe, Indonesia, and Argentina, ancient artists pressed one hand to the stone and blew pigment around it to make an outline. The vast majority of those outlined hands are left hands, which means the hand doing the blowing, the one steady enough to hold the pigment tube, was the right. So this is not a recent quirk. This goes deep, and it is not really a choice you ever made. You did not pick your dominant hand the way you picked your favorite color. Identical twins who share the exact same DNA can have different dominant hands. About 1 in 4 identical twin pairs split this way, so genetics on its own does not decide it. But genetics does load the dice. If both your parents are right-handed, you have about a 10% chance of being left-handed, same as the global average. If one parent is left-handed, your odds jump to roughly 17%. If both parents are left-handed, the number climbs to around 26%. There is also a small gender gap. Men are slightly more likely to be left-handed than women by a few percentage points, and researchers still are not sure why. The current best guess is that there is no single gene for left-handedness. There is a cluster of small genetic effects, and one specific tendency that geneticists have nicknamed right shift. Here is how it works. Your brain is cross-wired. The left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. The right side controls the left. In 99% of right-handers, language lives almost entirely primarily in the left hemisphere, in a region called Broca's area. It is named after the French scientist who discovered it in the 1860s. The same hemisphere that runs your dominant hand also runs your speech. There is even a small patch in that same left hemisphere called BA44 that fires up specifically when you make and use tools. The side of your brain built for speech is also the side built for handling objects. Hand control, language, and tool use all clustering on the same side of the brain. That clustering is what the right shift tendency creates. If you carry the shift, your dominant hand and your language both go to the left hemisphere, which means you end up right-handed. If you do not carry it, your brain does not get a clear instruction and your body picks a side more or less by chance. So left-handedness is not really a gene for being left-handed. It is the absence of the instruction to be right-handed. There is a clue about why we favor the right hand and not the left. It might come from something even older than tools. It might come from walking on two legs. Kangaroos walk upright too. And as far as we know, they are the only other mammals on Earth that show the same kind of species-wide hand preference humans do. Theirs goes the other way. Most kangaroos are left-handed, which suggests that walking upright on two legs and freeing up the hands somehow forces a brain to pick a side, no matter what species you are, which raises the obvious question. If being right-handed is the default our species drifted toward, why are there any lefties at all? Why has the 10% not disappeared? The answer comes from baseball. Among the top hitters in Major League history, roughly half of them bat left-handed, from a population where left-handers are only 10%. The same pattern shows up in boxing, fencing, tennis, cricket, and mixed martial arts. A 2019 study looked at thousands of professional combat sport matches and found that left-handed fighters win significantly more often than their right-handed opponents. Not because they are stronger, because they are rare. If you grow up training against right-handed opponents, your reflexes get tuned for right-handed attacks. Their shots come from one expected angle, their stance points one expected way. Then a lefty walks in, and everything is mirrored. You are off by a fraction of a second, which in a fight is the difference between landing a punch and eating one. The logic is simple. When something is rare, being that rare thing is an advantage. When it becomes common, the advantage disappears. That is why the number stays stuck around 10%. If too many people were lefty, the surprise factor would die and the edge would vanish. If too few were lefty, the genetic odds would push the number back up. The 10% is an evolutionary balance point. There is a second piece to this, though. A lot of life is not combat. It is cooperation. Using tools, sharing equipment, copying what someone else is doing, and tools going all the way back are built for the majority. Scissors, can openers, school desks, guitars, even the way cards are dealt in poker. Among the top golfers in the world, only about 4% are left-handed. In golf, you are not facing an opponent. You are alone against the course. The surprise advantage that lefties have in combat does not exist there. What does exist is a world of right-handed clubs, right-handed coaching, and right-handed instruction. So in tasks where you compete head-to-head, being a lefty is an advantage. But in tasks where you cooperate or use shared tools, being a lefty is a disadvantage. The 10% you see today is the math working itself out across both pressures, generation after generation. There is one more strange thing about left-handed brains. In most people, the two halves of the brain divide up work very strictly. Language happens almost entirely on the left side. Picturing things in your head, recognizing faces, and knowing where you are all happen mostly on the right. The two sides rarely overlap. Lefties are different. The same tasks that stay locked to one side in a righty often get spread across both sides in a lefty. Researchers have linked this to a few small effects. When the part of the brain that handles speech gets damaged, lefties often recover their language faster because their other hemisphere can step in and take over. Communication between the two sides of the brain also runs a bit quicker, and on tasks that require pulling information from different brain regions at once, lefties do slightly better. The British psychologist Chris McManus, who spent most of his career studying handedness, describes a left-hander's brain as just a little more spread out, less strict about which side does what. It is not a superpower. Plenty of lefties are completely average. But across a population, the wiring really is a bit different. Now think about how language has treated this difference. The Latin word for left is sinister. We still use it today to mean evil. Gauche The French word for left also means clumsy or socially awkward. And in English, your right hand is the skillful one, and being right means being correct. For most of recorded history, left-handed children were forced to switch. Teachers tied their left hands behind their backs. Parents slapped pens out of them. Schools across Europe and the Americas treated it as a defect to be corrected, in some places into the 1960s. And it almost never worked. The brain had already chosen. The brain was not negotiating. You did not decide which hand would be yours. Your brain had already picked a side before you took your first breath. And it was following a pattern that has held for 500,000 years. The hand you wave with, the one you write with. That hand is older than civilization. It is older than language. And the small fraction of you who reach with the other one are not a mistake. You are the reason the rest of us still have to be ready for 8 mice were placed inside a perfect world. 4 males, 4 females. They had unlimited food and unlimited water. There were no diseases or predators. Absolutely no threats of any kind. 5 years later, every single one of them was dead, and not a single death was caused by anything a vet could have diagnosed. This is Universe 25, the most disturbing experiment ever run on a society. In 1968, an American scientist named John Calhoun built something he called a paradise for mice. Soft nesting material in every corner, the temperature held perfectly stable, the cages cleaned by hand on a schedule. They were the healthiest specimens from the breeding colony of the National Institutes of Health. Calhoun was an ethologist. He had spent his entire career obsessed with one specific question: what happens to a society when nothing is hard anymore? He had been chasing the answer for 2 decades by the time he reached this experiment. He had built earlier versions in a quarter-acre forest in Maryland, in barn enclosures, and in laboratory rooms, 24 of them, one after another, each one a slightly different paradise for rats or mice with no scarcity, no predators, and no escape. In every single one of them, he had seen the same pattern. The population would explode, violence would spike, mating would distort into something twisted and hyperactive, then collapse into apathy, and the colony would die. He had documented the pattern 24 times. The 25th was meant to be the perfect one, the clean experiment, the final answer that nobody could argue with. He set it up inside a federal research lab in Maryland, a 9-foot square enclosure with apartments stacked along every wall, reached by mesh tunnels running floor to ceiling. Calhoun called them walk-up apartments. Each one was fed by hoppers that never ran empty and water bottles that never ran dry. He calculated the space could comfortably support around 3,800 mice. It would never come close to that number. On day 1, he placed his 8 founders inside and shut the lid. For the first 104 days, almost nothing happened. The mice explored, learned the geography, and worked out who slept where. Then the first litters were born, and the population began to double. Every 55 days, twice as many mice as before. By day 315, more than 600 animals were living inside. They climbed over each other on the ramps, slept in piles, and jostled for nesting space at the tops of the apartments. This is the moment everything began to come apart. In a normal mouse colony, when the population grows past what the territory can absorb, the surplus mice leave. They emigrate. They find new ground somewhere else. Inside Universe 25, there was no new ground. The young males with nowhere to go and no role to fill began drifting into the center of the enclosure. They formed listless pools of bodies. Calhoun would stand above the pen for hours, watching them do nothing. They had no fights to win, no females to court, nothing to defend. They were healthy, well-fed, and they had absolutely nothing to do. When one of them was attacked by another mouse, he would not fight back. He would lie there and absorb the damage, then stand up, walk a few feet, and lie down again. But not every male went quiet. A second group formed at the same time, on the opposite end of the spectrum. They were frantic and indiscriminate. They moved through the enclosure faster than any other mice. They forced themselves into nests other males were trying to defend. They skipped the courtship rituals every other mouse still followed. They refused to be deterred even by violence from dominant males. And in the worst pockets of the colony, behaviors began to appear that no functioning mouse society had ever produced. The females responded with their own retreat. The ones who could not find a place in the social order climbed to the highest apartments and lived alone. They stopped interacting with males. They stopped reproducing. Calhoun also noticed something he called the behavioral sink. Even when food was equally available everywhere, the mice began crowding compulsively around a few specific feeders. They would not eat alone. The presence of other mice had become so wired into their feeding instinct that an empty feeder, no matter how full, was useless to them. The crowding got worse and worse around a handful of stations while the rest of the enclosure sat almost untouched. Then the mothers who were still trying to raise pups began to fail in a much darker way. Defending a nest in that environment took constant work. The males who had originally claimed territory grew exhausted from patrolling and stopped protecting their families. The mothers had to defend the nest themselves while still nursing. They turned on their own young. They abandoned them in scattered places around the enclosure. Some forgot which pups belonged to them at all. Others stopped recognizing them as theirs entirely. And in the worst stretches, mothers began eating their own offspring. In some sections of the colony, fewer than 1 in 20 newborn mice survived to weaning. Calhoun would write later that, by this point, the social fabric of the colony was effectively dead. The bodies were still alive. The structure that held them together as a species was not. The pups that did survive were raised by mothers who barely cared whether they lived. They had no model of what a functioning life inside this place looked like. And when they grew up, they behaved like nothing Calhoun had ever seen. The males of this generation never fought. They never tried to mate. They never engaged in any social activity at all. They ate, they slept, and they groomed themselves obsessively. Their fur stayed perfect because they never got into a single fight. They moved through the colony as if no other mouse existed in it. Calhoun named them the beautiful ones. They looked, externally, like the healthiest mice in the entire colony. They were also, functionally, dead. They never tried to reproduce. They could not socialize. Their nervous systems had developed inside a world where every social role was already filled by someone else, and they had simply opted out of the species. On day 560, the population peaked at 2,200 mice. It would never go higher. The last successful conception inside Universe 25 happened on day 920. After that, no new mice were born. The colony continued to age. The beautiful ones kept grooming themselves. The secluded females stayed in their high apartments. Violence carried on in pockets, with no purpose left to it, and one by one the mice died of old age, with no replacements coming up behind them. On May 23, 1973, the last mouse in Universe 25 died, 4 years and 10 months after Calhoun shut the lid. He wrote that the mice had died 2 deaths. The first was the death of the spirit. The second was the death of the body. The first one happened years before the second. When his paper came out, the world ran with the obvious reading: comfort kills. Abundance kills. A life with no struggle is a life that destroys itself. The image of the beautiful ones, perfect looking and quietly extinct, became one of the most cited metaphors of the late 20th century. Urbanists pointed to it. Religious leaders. Politicians on every side of every issue. Anyone who wanted to warn about the decay of modern life found something in those mice they could use. But that reading was not what Calhoun actually said. His real conclusion was sitting there in the paper, in his own words. For an animal as complex as a human being, he wrote, a similar collapse was not just possible. It was logical. If the number of individuals capable of filling meaningful roles greatly exceeds the number of roles available, only violence and disruption can follow. The killer wasn't comfort, it was the disappearance of meaningful roles. When the population grew faster than the supply of meaningful roles the colony could offer, the mice with no place stopped functioning. The fighters had no one to fight. The mothers were defending nests that no one helped them keep. The young grew up with nothing they were expected to inherit. The structure that gave each individual mouse a reason to participate in the species evaporated. The food never ran out. The water never ran out. What ran out was something nobody had thought to put in the paradise to begin with. Comfort didn't kill them. It just removed the friction that made being alive feel like something. And here is the part almost nobody quotes. Calhoun himself was not a doomer. He spent the rest of his career not predicting the collapse, but trying to prevent it. He kept building new universes. He kept changing the variables. He was looking for the single thing he could put back into a paradise that would let it keep working. He believed it could be done. He believed humans could choose differently than the mice did. He wrote that as physical space contracts, the only way forward is to extend ourselves into conceptual space, into ideas, into networks, into the work of building roles that did not exist before. He called it ideational generativity, a long phrase for a simple idea. The way out is to keep making new reasons to be here. But the experiment is still sitting there in the data. A perfectly designed paradise, 8 mice, 5 years, a complete extinction, and a cause of death no toxicology report would ever be able to name. The mice didn't have a choice. We still do. What happens